This morning we're going to be concluding, for now, a series of lessons on biblical womanhood, biblical femininity, and we've looked at several aspects of that. And this morning, what I want to do is talk about women from the standpoint of what is the ideal woman, the strength of women. When we think about masculinity, I think some of the aspects of that, some of the even biblical aspects of that come freely to mind. And when we talk about women, either one or two things, either we can't think of the things that are, most idealistic, most pointed and unique when it comes to women's roles. Or when we do think of them, we don't think of them as gloriously as we ought to, as lifted up as we ought to. In Proverbs 31, of course, you have this picture of the ideal woman, I think, that the young man is being pointed to take note of what she looks like, what her activities are, and so forth. And very often, when we point to that, we're pointing to it in a ladies' class or something of that nature, or maybe we might even point to it in a men's class of here's what an excellent wife looks like. In verse 25, it says of her that strength and majesty are her clothing, and she smiles at the future. I want to think about that. When a woman is clothed in strength and majesty, what does that look like? You know, what does that entail? A lot of people, when they are going to the scriptures and picking out women to look at, they go and look for women or try or somehow twist to try to find women that really exemplify masculine qualities, and then hold that up and say, these are the great women of the Bible. I think they've got it all wrong on a number of counts that we'll look at. I think we need to be looking for women who have feminine strength, not masculine strength, but feminine strength, and who hold that in a way that causes the due attention and honor of all those who are around her, as this woman in Proverbs 31 does. I want to think about that idea of looking at biblical heroines to begin with. Too often, people look back, and even when there are great women, either in history or in literature or in the Bible, they miss the point of why they're heroines. I love the biography that David McCullough wrote of John Adams. I think it's just an excellent biography. And a miniseries was made of that biography several years ago, and we watched it, and there were a lot of things that they did very well. One of the things that they did very poorly was the way that they presented his wife, Abigail Adams, who is a very interesting person and someone who had lots of letters back and forth with her husband that we can still read today. And so many of those letters showed her as a tremendous asset to her husband, as the very helpmeet that God would want a wife to be. But in the miniseries, you can't have that. So what you got is really a champion of women's rights. You've got this woman who's way outspoken and culturally steps out. And none of it's true. They distort the way that she's presented in history and so forth. But they just can't conceive of a woman being great in the role of a woman. And so they have to somehow pull her. The same thing is true. You know, every time I hear, they're going to make another miniseries of Little Women. Great. I want nothing to do with it. Guarantee you they're going to ruin it. They're going to misunderstand why the people in that book are good, why the bad people are bad, and it happens every single time. And so no matter what they're doing, they're going and rewriting those narratives. Well, the same thing is true in the Bible. There certainly are numerous women highlighted in Scripture for their virtues. We think of Esther and Ruth and Deborah and Rahab and Miriam, the sister of Moses, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and so many others that we pick out. and or that we can see in Scripture, and we can look and see those characteristics. But I think sometimes people go and they want to find things that are not there. They want to pull out virtues that are not highlighted. And in some way, they're just sort of desperate to find a heroine who depicts the modern notions of heroism, which is basically just a hero, a man dressed up as a woman and being a hero. That's like in the Marvel universe or whatever, when they make women superheroes. That's all they're doing is they have long hair and tighter clothes, but they're doing the same thing the men are doing, right? They don't make women heroes who are heroes because they are women. And this is one of the problems, I think, with the way the modern mind looks at women. When we look back at these examples, one of the things that it's important to do is to make sure that we understand what about even these women is heroic and what is not. So in Genesis chapter 38, and in verse 26, it says Judah recognized the implements that Tamar had taken from him. He recognized them and said, "She, Tamar, is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her again." All right, that is a statement that requires some pondering. That Tamar is more righteous than Judah. What you don't want to do is then say everything Tamar did is now justified and held up as righteous. There's a comparative element here. We don't want to say that we take a prescriptive instruction from the way everything Tamar has done things. But yes, she has conducted herself certainly better than her father-in-law, though there's a lot of distortedness that's happening here. And I think that's what happens. People go back in a story and they just say, here is somebody that's held up as honorable. Therefore, everything they did is honorable. That's not true. That's not true of any character. And it's certainly not true of the women in the Bible. And so we want to distinguish. We want to say, now here is a woman that is considered righteous, but make some distinctions between what she did that was righteous and what she did that was maybe unrighteous, or maybe isn't even commented on, right? This part over here is not the point. This part over here is the point. This is what we're supposed to learn from, not that over there. In fact, I would go one further. We even need to practice some restraint in who we say are the heroines and who is not a heroine. So, for instance, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, when David commits adultery with Bathsheba, everybody wants to figure out what to do with Bathsheba. I think Bathsheba's not the point. Is Bathsheba a hero for women's right and women suffering under the oppression of men, or is she an adulterous temptress towards David? I think Bathsheba is almost a background character to what's going on here. David's sin is what's under consideration, and Uriah's faithfulness is what's under consideration. And whether or not Bathsheba was a willing participant doesn't change the sinfulness of David or the faithfulness of Uriah. You see, her status is unimportant to the point to be drawn from the text. But everybody's got to draw something. And so we've got people taking sides, wanting to make either Bathsheba the primary villain or the primary hero, and I think she's neither, right? Why not just let her sit there in the background and make no more definitive judgments about her than the text does? I think the same thing is true, for instance, back in 1 Samuel chapter 18. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, we have the character of Michal, the daughter of Saul. It says there, David rose up and went, and he and his men struck down 200 men among the Philistines, and David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave Michal his daughter as a wife. And as we go on, what do you make of Michal? Just kind of a sad story, isn't it? Like, is she a hero? Well, there's times in which she does some noble things, in which she protects David and so forth. And then there's times where she just seems to get bitter and jealous and devolve into that. And what do you do with her? I'm not sure you want to do a whole lot with her. She's part of the story indeed, but she's neither the hero of the story nor the villain. Now, her dad's the villain, and her husband is the hero, who incidentally both have good and bad to them as well. But Michal's not the point of the story. She comes along as an element of the story. Now, a lot of people are going to say, oh, so you're just shoving women into the background. No more than I'm shoving a whole lot of men into the background as well, right? It's not all the men that are the point of the story. And so the same thing is true here with any number of these women. Over in Luke chapter 8, and verse 3, as we are given a list of women who were ministering to Jesus, it says, with their possessions. Among them is Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's manager. I have a couple of books in my office that one of them I think is titled All the Women of the Bible, and another one's titled maybe Women of the Bible or something like that. And so you go through and it picks out a woman, and you have one of them is a daily devotional, and so it picks out a woman, and you have 3 or 4 days of contemplating this woman's role. And one of the women it picks out is Joanna, the wife of Chuza. And there are 4 days of devotional literature given to Joanna, the wife of Chuza. Now, she certainly is commended. But what you know about Joanna of Chuza is what I just read. And that's it. And in fact, after about a page and a half of talking about the possibilities of what all can be implied here, it says, now really all we know is she was the wife of somebody who was the manager of Caesar. It's like, yes. And that she ministered to Jesus. Yes. And the whole other page. But people are so desperate to find more female heroes because they want some sort of maybe equality among the number of female heroes and male heroes or something, that they will just go and make stuff up out of whole cloth in order to have more heroes. And even when we're talking about somebody who's commended, we want to be careful about that. We're going to be looking at the Judges in a little bit later in the quarter after we finish up the book of Joshua. There's going to be some judges, we're going to get to them, and you're going to have like one sentence. And you might say, well, let's have a whole class on that. Let's not. It's one sentence. That's what you get. And I'm not saying there may not be a little bit more you can draw out about that and maybe understand about some implications made from that sentence, but let's limit it to what can actually be implied. And so we want to be careful about that. Some people will go even so far in the desperation to make a hero out of Eve. Talked about that before, that she was willing to step out boldly and to question authority and things of that nature. Is there ever a clearer case of somebody being in the wrong than Eve, and then following that her husband Adam? But yet somehow they make even that into a twisted story of heroism. Well, along with that, then, even when we are dealing with heroines, we want to be very careful that we don't sort of give modern spin to these ancient texts. A lot of different ways people go about that. So Proverbs 31, we open up Proverbs 31 and we see all the activity of this Proverbs 31 woman. And so someone wants to put that into a modern context and say, look, this woman is running a real estate agency. Someone buying a field does not make them a real estate agent. Now, it does make them a wise steward of money, and I do think that there's economic activity, and that needs to be a conversation that's had, but it doesn't make her into some local CEO of a business. In Acts chapter 16, Lydia, she's a CEO of a local purple selling shop. No, here is a woman selling fabric in order to support herself and presumably those of her household. The same thing is true with Judges chapter 4. As we look at Deborah, here she is sitting under a tree, and people are coming to her to hear her wisdom, and people are saying, here basically is a prime minister. Not even close. This is not some woman, and in fact, I think as you look through the text and the context, that this is not somebody who has pursued the authority over the nation, but that the nation has devolved into depending upon this woman for authority because she is wise and they are not. And so the idea of trying to put modern titles, modern situations back into the scripture, I understand we want to make applications to the modern world, absolutely. But some of that involves our trying to transport our situations or trying to maybe step away from some of the modern ways of life so that we can get back to the application that's being made in the text. Well, then I want to spend the rest of our time looking at some heroines, some various texts in scriptures, and pick out what is the glory of these women, what is not versus what is the glory that's being depicted in any of these cases. And the first is that of wisdom, and particularly the influence that women can have when they are wise. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 1, it says, the wise woman builds her house, but the woman of folly tears it down with her own hands. What does it mean for a woman to build her house? Obviously, it doesn't mean that the wise woman goes and cuts the timbers and assembles them just so. But the idea is that she provides foundations for the greatness of the house. And again, I think you see that over in Proverbs chapter 31 in verse 26, the very next verse of what we read a moment ago. She opens her mouth in wisdom, and the instruction of loving kindness is on her tongue. People look to her for wisdom. Think about the contrast over in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 7, where Paul tells Timothy, refuse godless myths fit only for old women. Some of your translations say old wives' tales. On the other hand, train yourself for the purpose of godliness. Just like there is a stereotype that Paul warns Timothy against in his youth, let no one despise your youth. There's also a stereotype of silly old women. And Paul is telling Timothy not to get caught up in that as well. And women do well to stay clear of the stereotype of the silly old woman, or frankly, the silly young woman. Amy gave a talk this weekend on Friday night about feminism to some ladies down towards Birmingham. And leading up to that, she was reading The Feminist Mystique. And, she was doing that, she's reading it so they don't have to thing. And it is. I would come in and I would hear her huff and I would watch. She goes, you would not believe. But one of the things that Gloria Steinem. Is it Gloria Steinem or Betty Friedan? Betty Friedan. One of the things that she's critiquing is the silliness of women's magazines. And she's saying, look at all of the silly ways these magazines appeal to women. Agreed. Burn the whole thing down. Every grocery store magazine aisle, burn it all to the ground. I'm on board with you. That is a problem. But of course, her solution is not, let us have wise women in the home, right? She takes the worst elements of women just pouring themselves into the silliness of the world, and then by contrast, she doesn't hold up the Proverbs 31 woman, she holds up a CEO, right? As if he doesn't have silly things that he does. So we have to be careful that we don't get sucked into all of that. We don't get sucked in to the silliness of not just the grocery store magazines, but the social media feeds, which is where most of that silliness is contained now. Getting wrapped up in the lives of celebrities and the tittle tattle and gossip of the world. These are things that are associated. Gossip is the thing that's associated, that Paul associates. But here's a woman who keeps herself from all of that. Here's a woman who says things and people remember those things. I love to hear old men say, my grandmother used to say. What he's saying is her influence has continued here through all of these years and these generations that I still remember my grandmother used to say. My sister, for Christmas this year, she wrote a book about our grandmother and gifted us all with that book so that we can remember and that our children and our grandchildren can say, oh, my grandmother used to say. This ought to be a foundational element of the home. In Proverbs chapter 31 and verse 23, her husband is known in the gates when he sits with the elders of the land. Why is that a compliment to her? Because her wisdom and her activity from that wisdom is what provides for that. The reason he's sitting in the gates in this context is because of what she's doing in the home. Now, I want to say this about that before we move forward here. We need to be careful that we do not that we do not have the notion that what women do in the home does not require thoughtfulness and wisdom. Too many times when we talk about women in the home and so forth, and we talk about maybe education and so forth, well, she doesn't need an education. She needs an education. Now, she may not need a collegiate education. In fact, I think most people don't these days. There's a lot of aspects of education that a lot of us don't need. She needs wisdom. And that wisdom is going to come from educating self, from us educating our daughters in the things, not just in the hands-on practical elements, though that's important, but also how to think, how to interact. Because one day she may even be called on to be an Abigail, who is not, in fact, a feminist icon. But in 1 Samuel chapter 25, what we see is Abigail, who is married to a fool, who is married to a man who she says his name matches who he is. He's a worthless man. And Abigail has to step out and practice wisdom that is not derived from her husband, but rather is exercised in contrast to her husband. And you recall that there David comes and he's about to lay waste to Nabal and all that belongs to him. And Abigail's servants, or the servants of the house, hear this and they go to Abigail. Why? Because they know that she is wise and Nabal is not. That they can't get help from the worthless man. But there is somebody wise in this household. And she can do something about it. And what does she do about it? She goes in humility and with humble advice to David and pleads the case. And David hears, and what he says is, you've saved not just your household, but me as well. And so Abigail is able to use her wisdom even when her husband is not part of that. How much better if her husband is part of that? But she is a picture. Somebody says Abigail's one of the heroes. She's one of the women who rises up. She's one of the women who shows what it's like to be a wise woman or wise woman when you are in the house of a foolish man. And so we want wisdom in our homes. We want wisdom in our mothers and in our grandmothers and in our daughters. Well, another aspect that we see is devoted service. Back to Proverbs chapter 31, again, Proverbs chapter 31 and verse 12, it says, she deals bountifully with him, that is, her husband, deals bountifully with him for good and not evil all the days of her life. On down in verse 15, it says, she rises while it is still night and gives food to her household and a portion to her young women. this hard-working, never-stopping woman who is devoted to her husband and to her children and to her household in its entirety, is tireless in her service. I was reading an article recently, and this woman said she had recently become a Christian. And she was struggling because she's come out of the world. She was a sex worker, to use the parlance of the day. And she's come away from that. But what she was struggling with was this depiction of traditional womanhood within churches. And she was saying, you know, I love Jesus, and I love what he's done in my life and all of this. But this notion that a woman, that there's this singular picture of what a woman looks like. And then she went on to say, that's fine for people who want that, but and this is her words, I am not so naive as to give my life over to a man and to wreck my body having children. So when she says it's fine for those who want it, she doesn't really mean it. She's saying for those who want it, they're fools and they are self-destructive. People look at a picture of a woman who does what the Proverb 31 woman does, and they say, that woman is ruining her life. But the whole point of Proverbs 31 is she is building a life. She is building a life that is not just, people say, it's just in the service of her husband. It's frankly in the service of herself too. She sits on and reaps the benefits of all that she is pouring into that household. And that's one of the things that you see as she goes on, as you continue on throughout the text there in Proverbs 31. Back over to Luke chapter 3 this time. Luke chapter 2. There in verse 36, there are just a couple of people highlighted here in these first days of Jesus' life. One of them being Simeon, and then we come down here to Anna, the prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher, it says. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow to the age of 84. She never left the temple, serving night and day with fastings and prayers. And at that very moment, she came up and began giving thanks to God and continued to speak of him to all those who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. Here's a woman who is not married. And she's not been married, it seems like, for some time, because it appears that her husband died young, 7 years into their marriage, and he died. And then what does she do? She continues to devote herself now to the service of the temple. Right? She doesn't say, well, I'm free from the shackles of service. No, she transfers that devotion, moves it over to another type of service, and continues that for the rest of her life. And for that, she is one of the privileged few to be spoken of as receiving Jesus here in these early days after his birth, along with Simeon, recognizing that he was the one for whom they had been seeking and the one who came to bring salvation. I think women are created to nurture and care for others. Now, in all of this and everything that we're looking at no point am I saying men don't need any of these characteristics. But I'm saying if a woman wants to lean into being a woman, lean into what God says about being a woman, these are the kinds of things that a woman ought to lean into and learn more about. To be of service. How can I lean into nurture? That motherhood instinct. Well, obviously, being a mother would be one of those things. But also there are other ways that you might go about service. Over in Luke chapter 24, kind of going along what we just said here in Luke chapter 2, one of the favorite sort of lines from people who are looking for feminist heroines in Scripture women were the first gospel preachers. So that's the great line there. Women were the first gospel preachers because, after all, they're the first ones who told about the resurrection. And so, therefore, there's no difference in that, in reporting what they saw and actually getting up in churches and preaching in that role of authority. Now, aside from the nonsensical nature of that, just notice, we mentioned this list of women earlier in the book of Luke. But here in Luke chapter 24, it tells us about why they are the ones who saw Jesus first and were therefore the ones to report it. It says, on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb bringing the spices which they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And it goes on to tell us about their perplexity, their asking of questions, and their recognizing upon being told he is not here but risen, and they go and tell the good news to the others. Now people act like what's happening here is that these women were chosen in contradistinction to men to be the ones to spread the news. Well, that gets real weird as you continue reading through Acts and the letters to the Christians, because it looks like the men get chosen to be the primary ones to continue to spread that message. But why were they there? They were there to serve Jesus. And it wasn't that they were there because they believed in the resurrection and the apostles didn't. That's another thing that sort of gets kind of implied out there. That here are women who continue to have faith when everybody else had lost the faith. They're there to take care of a dead body. Now, that's nurture and service. But it's not them believing in the resurrection yet. It's them showing up to do the things that women do and being rewarded for showing up and doing the things that women do. And it is a great reward, and it is a great honor. And I don't want to take away from that at all, but the reason the honor is given is because they are doing the things that women do. They are continuing to serve him even after his death. I have a book that we recently got, a story that I read to Rylant. It's called Crispin's Rainy Day. And in the story, this little boy's about to go play pirates and stuff, and his sister wants to come along, and he's like, nah, this isn't for girls. And she ends up tagging along anyway, and she says, I've brought food. And he says, that's sissy stuff. You know, we're pirates, we're not eating that kind of stuff. And so he kind of shoves her over here. And when he shoves her over there, they're playing imaginary. She says, well, this is a mess, let me at least clean it up. And so she does that, and later she feeds them. And then in the story, the girl gets taken away by a dragon and put up into a tower. And when she gets put up in the tower, it's a mess. She says, this is terrible. I'm not going to sit here and pout. I'm going to clean up. And one of the things she does is she's throwing all the junk out. She throws the magic sword out that he uses to kill the dragon. Now, I know it's a lot to take in. But the point is, and the author is making this point, she ends up being the hero because she's doing what women do. That's why she's the hero. And this author thought little boys and little girls need to hear stories about women being heroes by being women, not by telling the boys to get out of the way and let me do your job, but by filling their task and role well and providing by that the means for salvation. So I think that is an important element here, is that we convey to our daughters. Well, another element is, of course, submission, faithful submission. There's so many stories that we can see of this. Esther is certainly not the picture of a woman who defied her role and so forth, but rather a woman who seems to constantly submit herself to the roles that she's placed in, and through that submission provide deliverance for her people. Mordecai comes and says, for such a time as this, And she submits to that moment. But when she goes into the king, when she goes in to ask, she doesn't walk in the door and say, listen here. She kneels before the king. She hopes for his favor. And when he gives her the favor, what does she do? Let me cook you a meal. It's, again, not the place of a woman who is stepping outside of that old traditional role, but rather a woman who is embracing that traditional role. And through the embracing, influences the most powerful man in the world to deliver the people of God. That is the power of submission. At a much more local and finite level, Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verses 1 and 2, how do you change a man's rebellious heart? It is through submissive behavior. You talk about countercultural. You talk about something that flips everything on its head. The very opposite notion is what people think ought to be done, rather than, by all means, don't let him run over you. And I agree, there are ways in which women certainly don't need to let men run over them. But he says this is the way that you're going to win the heart of a non-believer. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 and on into chapter 2, we see the picture of Hannah, who desperately wants a child. God, it says, has shut her womb. She comes and she prays to God, and as she prays, she prays with a promise that she would devote her son to God if he would give her but one. He does grant her that. And as we come into chapter 2, we're told that right after the boy is weaned, the next thing she does, the next thing we're told that she does, is brings that boy to Eli and hands him over. I cannot think of a more beautiful picture of faithful submission to God than this woman who is given the thing that she's longed for, promising to give it up to God if she could receive it, and then does. And again, what is the result? But a deliverer of Israel has risen up again, because this woman acted faithfully. Well, of course, along those lines, in Luke chapter 1 and verse 38, in Luke chapter 1 and verse 38, when Mary is told that she would bear a child, after some questions about how that's going to work, because she is a virgin, the angel answers her how that's going to work. And Mary said in verse 38, "Behold, the slave of the Lord, may it be done to me according to your word." And the angel departed from her. I think about that in contrast to that woman's article, "I'm not going to destroy my body having children." What potential disaster comes to Mary because of this? What shame must she endure having a child as a virgin? There's a weight there. And then the weight would continue because she has to go through life, especially as Jesus begins his ministry, and then as he goes to the cross, she has to endure all that as a mother. But I believe she maintains this picture right here. If that's what you need from me, that's what I'll do. And so when women rise up against God's pattern, God's law, instruction with regards to women in their homes, and say, I don't want to submit myself to the potential difficulties of putting myself in that situation. First of all, they're not even recognizing the potential blessings, but maybe there really are more potential difficulties. Understand that there is great power in submitting to God's pattern. And there are great benefits that he promises either now or certainly in the world to come by submitting to that role and that position that we're in. And let me just say, it takes a great deal of strength to be in that position when it's difficult. What Peter is saying in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verses 1 and 2 is not easy. The easy thing to do is to lash out. and to say, I'll not be told anything about what to do by you. The hard thing is to say, I am going to continue to show this man respect and honor and kindness as God has called me to, and trust in him that he will bring the increase. That is the position of strength, not the one that defies God's command. Well, finally, there is a need for cultural resistance. And I see this in a great many of these pictures. Not against the culture of God, but against the culture of the world. I think a lot of people, when they think of cultural resistance, they're really talking about rebelling against God, resisting God. But I mean resisting the actual culture around us. People act like, the other day, the woman preaching a sermon in front of Donald Trump and some of his entourage and J.D. Vance. You may have seen some of this. This woman got up at the Episcopal church there, and she preached about the LGBT kids who are so afraid right now, and urged him to have mercy on them and others. And some people said, oh boy, what a great job. Boy, really speaking truth to power. As if she was pressing against a culture. And then she got invited on The View and on CNN. Yeah, really standing up to the culture. No, that's not cultural resistance. That's cultural compliance. Cultural resistance is sticking by what God says no matter what everybody else is doing. I think of Moses' mother in Exodus chapter 2. Can you imagine the confidence that it requires to go through and do what Moses' parents did and what Moses' mother did? To, as it says, refuse to comply with the mandate that you kill that child. And then, after it's hidden and found, to go and to submit yourself to the fact that you're going to be a nursemaid to your own son, because the powers that be, the oppressors, have taken him as their own. But to maintain, obviously, enough cultural resistance that she raised a son who would defy the world power and deliver his people. Oh, that's a level of certainty that we could use. What about Ruth? Ruth is a Moabite. Does she act like a Moabite? Not based on what we see of the Moabites throughout Scripture, but let me go one further. Does she act like Israel acted at that time? When she comes into Israel, she doesn't just fall into whatever they are doing. She has a level of virtue and integrity that defies both the home country and even the country that she adopted. She would be true regardless of them. And so I think Ruth stands out in that way. And then, of course, what about Rahab? Rahab by no means is a picture of somebody who is in tune with the culture. She defies as much as can be defied. She commits treason towards her culture. In order to separate and distinguish herself, I will not be part of this. And so she delivers herself and all of her household. Back over in Proverbs chapter 31 and verse 25 that we started with, strength and majesty are her clothing, and she smiles at the future. I think when women inhabit all of these characteristics that God has held up, that God has said is glorious, that's the way that they walk around with strength and majesty. And when the world is saying, don't you know what's going to happen to you? Don't you know what that's going to lead to? Don't you see the failure in that sort of process and that plan? She smiles at the future. Because she knows better than they do. Because God knows better than they do. And so she knows. They don't know. They think that this is a path to ruin. She knows that this is the path to prosperity, the path to salvation, the path to the deliverance of herself and her people, which is her household. That is strength and dignity. And what we need is women who are unaffected by all the jobs. who just let it roll off. And the jobs come in every shape and form. It's every movie, it's every story, it's every song. And just be unaffected and smile at the future, knowing that this is the path to the future that we want, that God has promised us. Well, I know there's more that can be said about any and all of this. But I believe that if a woman's greatest glory is to figure out what men do best and try to do that, then we will always end up in these silly debates about women in sports and what men can do better and trying to figure out some way to bring women up to the same place as men. Well, it's because you're competing in an arena that is not the strength of women. And so what a foolish place to be. But when women take up the roles God has given them and embrace them truly, then they truly come alongside men and shine in the glory God has given them. They bring glory in the way that they ought to. They turn the tides of history. They have world-shaping influence, but they do it by being fully women, not by trying to be men with lipstick and high heels. Do you want to fulfill God's glory for you? You want to have fulfillment. That's a lot of the arguments against these things. Don't you want fulfillment? Yes. Through glorifying God. God wants to give that to you. He's not trying to keep you from it like the world will tell you. He's trying to keep you from the lies that tell you that out there somewhere is greater glory. It is despair and disappointment and ultimately destruction. Always has been. And so if you want what God offers, then come to him submitting to that in whatever way is required of you so that you can be all that he has created you to be and find that ultimate fulfillment. If there's any way we can help you with that, won't you come forward while we stand and while we sing.